So, Genesis chapter 2, we have the first man who's all by himself. He's surrounded by animals that are at least friendly to him, depending on your the way that you approach the scriptures in Genesis. You may either believe that that means that all animals were actually non-carnivorous at the time, or simply that God made them gentle when they encountered man. But either way, he is able to name all of them. He gives names to all the cattle and the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. But then it says, for Adam there was not a helper suitable, or not found a helper suitable for him. Which is interesting, because what it's really saying is that Adam didn't find a helper that was suitable for him. Presumably God already understood that there wasn't a helper that was suitable for him, because God had created all the other animals, male and female. He made one of each, or multiple of each, as he created them. And so he was mindful of the fact that there was a design of male and female when it comes to the animals. When it comes to anything higher order than some very, very basic organisms on our world, there is a dimorphism between them. But Adam can't find anybody that's the right person for him, the right thing for him. And so God, it says, caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. And he slept, and then he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. I can remember back when I was a younger, maybe a kid or a teenager at the most, somebody suggesting to me that maybe men had one less rib than women because they had, that Adam had a rib taken out, and so all of us did. And all you have to do is a basic x-ray to find out that that's not true. Adam might have had one less rib than everybody else did, but we don't all have to have a rib taken to make women, because now we have another way to do that. So when we talk about the rib, that was an Adam thing, not an every man thing. So God fashions into woman the rib which he had taken from the man. Now this is also really interesting. Why didn't he just create a woman in the first place? The same way that he created female versions of the birds and the beasts and the cattle and all that stuff. Why didn't he just do that in the first place?
Of the hierarchy, because the man stands over the wife. He is the head of the wife. Jesus is the head of the man. Okay, so one argument or one theory would be that he did that in order to create a hierarchy that doesn't necessarily exist in nature, independent of the created order of man and woman. And certainly Paul talks about that created order when he talks about, that the man was created first and then the woman was created from him. And so he uses that as part of his argument. Steve?
I believe it really leads more to the symbolism of the whole process. The flesh of my flesh, the side, you took the side, I gave, and now they're side by side. They become one, out of one, they become one.
Okay.
And all that kind of symbolism.
So there's a different kind of symbolism here of the joining of two, where in Adam and Eve's case, literally she was bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, because she was created from him specifically. And so there's a non-symbolic truth there that helps to create a larger symbolic truth later on, which actually I think is kind of in a way the exact same underlying logic, although Sylvia is applying it to in a different way. It's the exact same logic of there was a physical truth that Adam was created first and the woman second, and then out of that comes a larger spiritual truth. And in this case, that's also true, that Adam is created first, the rib is taken to make her joined to him, so that joining is a recompletion of the whole, not simply two different people getting together and having a less permanent or less serious joining together. Okay, anybody else? Any other theories or ideas about this? And the only other thing that I would add to this is that well, animals might be cognizant of the fact that they can't find a mate, since the mating desire is very strong in most animals, at least at some point in their existence. They don't necessarily experience that in a spiritual way, because they don't experience anything in a spiritual way. And so for the man to not have a companion and to become mindful of this would be a different kind of experience than a giraffe or a lion or a bird of some sort, realizing that they couldn't find a mate. it would be a much more, he would be much more conscious of that loss in more ways than an animal might be. And so perhaps part of what was happening here was to help Adam appreciate the significance of having a partner who was designed for him, as opposed to where animals might not appreciate that distinction quite as much because they don't think in a coherent sort of way the way we do. Jared?
The translators in the New King James says, not found a helper comparable to him.
Okay.
Instead of suitable. I think that might be more along the idea you're talking about too.
Yes, yeah, because I mean, we find with domesticated animals, we find lots of ways to fill in needs that we have. You know, dogs are for companionship and hunting and things like that. Oxen help to, you know, move earth and different things like that. And all sorts of animals we use them in so many different ways, not just as food, but in so many other ways. But to have someone who is somebody that's comparable to us is a very different thing. And finding someone like that, whether it's an individual find or whether it's the broader sense of finding another human being who has the same basic makeup as we do, spiritual and physical intelligence and reasoning and these kinds of things, is definitely something that we would recognize as a lack if we didn't have that.
And the animals probably didn't talk back to him.
I would imagine not. You know, I doubt any of them said to him, you know, I don't care for that name that you gave me, could you try again? You know, that sort of a thing. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So you can't yet, you know, as much as we might talk to our animals and, you know, and anthropomorphize them, treat them like they are human in certain ways, and I'm as guilty of it as, maybe not as anybody. I've seen some people that are really out of control, but I am guilty of that. But on some level, at least, most of us that are working with all of the marbles that God gave us recognize that there is a distinction between whatever animal we might talk to and treat like they're human and a real human. You know. Now we live in a society that gets a little bit out of whack about that. You know, it's interesting to recognize that there were probably more people that were outraged that Michael Vick was engaged in dogfighting than were outraged because of some of the different NFL players who'd beaten up women and caused them serious injury or gotten drunk and crashed a car and killed somebody, because dogs are cuter than people sometimes, and since they can't talk, they don't become nearly as irritating as they do. And so sometimes we tend to give them maybe a little more value than we should, but still, there's a difference, and our courts have recognized that too. Our courts recognize that animals do not have rights. Organizations sometimes have rights to protect them, but animals do not have rights, and they cannot exercise any of the constitutional rights that humans are given under our Constitution, for example. And so there is a distinction between the two things, and Adam was incomplete until he had Eve. So Adam says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And for this reason," and this is interesting because this is an editorial note presumably by Moses, who's going along here writing this down. Moses goes, "Hey, by the way, just want you all to know, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." So this is not Adam saying that. This is God saying this through Moses. Here's this important thing to understand, that this is why you do this, because you were built to do this. And God likes to remind us about that sometimes, that we were built to do the things that we do sometimes. So, okay, so we're going to talk today and for probably several weeks to come about this notion of man and wife and some of the larger concepts that implies as well. So we see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, "You shall not commit adultery." This is the second of the most clearly other-directed commandments. Although, as we'll see, it is also one of the ones, as all of the commandments do, that implies or has relationship to other expectations about our interactions with God as well. Just like murder had to do with how we live before God and how we treat His creation, this one has to do with some ideas that are very much tied up into our relationship with God. Okay, so in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, the scriptures say, if a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die. The man who lay with the woman, thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. So, this is the closest we get to a formal command regarding adultery outside of the you shall not commit adultery. And so we have a man, so let me ask you, you've all read it and you can all read it again. Tell me, in a strict interpretation, what scenario does this encompass? Who has to be married?
A woman.
Woman. What if the man isn't married?
Doesn't say anything about that.
Doesn't say anything about that. Okay, so whether the man is married or not doesn't matter. If the woman is married, we've got adultery. Now, obviously you don't have it in front of you, and so you're going to have to take my word for this. But I can't find anywhere in the scriptures that gives us a reciprocal commandment to that. If a married man is found lying with a woman, then both of them shall die. Does that strike any of you as kind of interesting?
Well, as far as the dying part, but there are other scriptures that speak of adultery in the sense that a man who lusts after a woman is committing adultery in his heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that the man is innocent here, just we don't have a repeat with the reciprocal thing. And maybe that's a cultural thing at the time, but I don't believe God says it's okay for a man to do it, but not a woman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or in this case, arguably, it's okay for, okay, so when we have the, remember we have the original command that says you shall not commit adultery. So the underlying command says you can't commit adultery. Adultery is the breach of the marriage relationship. That would go either way. So what we see in Deuteronomy 22 is not a restatement and overruling of the original principle. It is a here's the penalty for violating the principle. So what is less clear then is for sure what's supposed to happen if someone in the opposite situation, a man who is married and a single woman were to be caught in the act of adultery. It is less clear about that.
It seems in several places in Jeremiah that the man that goes after the neighbor's wife is wrong. I mean that, and I think I don't think you could use. I mean that definitely, and he condemns that action.
Yeah, but technically that's the same thing as we've already got up here, isn't it?
That's right, except it's referring to the man
The
going
man who goes after the neighbor's wife. A
Yeah.
man is found lying with a married woman.
Yeah.
That's the same thing.
Well, it probably is. I guess that would be the same. I was assuming he was married.
And that's the thing is, when we read this, we assume they're both married.
Yeah.
But it doesn't strictly say that.
Doesn't say
And so
that.
the lawyer in me is coming out to play for a little while here. So keep up with me as best you can. The point, I'm not trying to make the point that there isn't necessarily a difference in how it's treated. What I'm saying is that it's interesting, and I do think it's at least partly cultural that it's written this way. Let me get Sylvia, because she's had that.
Isn't also that's the only way that Moses said somebody can get divorced if there is adultery. So it's a man and woman.
Wait, Moses did or Jesus did?
No, I think it's in Moses, in Exodus, Leviticus, that he gave when he had to judge them, and he gave them as you can give a woman a certificate of divorce if there was occurring adultery. So that is, it's a very...
That I think you're conflating together Moses' law with what Jesus said. Because Jesus actually does say that the only circumstance, we're going to get to that a little later, but we'll address it right now because it's been brought up. Jesus says the only acceptable, maybe that's where you're at, Ian, so if that's where you're at, go ahead and tell us.
No, my question is different.
Okay, let me finish this, then I'll come to you. So Jesus is the one who says that Moses permitted you to get divorced because you have a hard heart. But I'm telling you that the only valid reason to get divorced is if there has been unfaithfulness or impurity, depending on the translation. But what he's clearly talking about is a sexual violation of the marriage covenant. So that's Jesus taking Moses a step further, as he did with a number of things in the Sermon on the Mount, where it's do not murder, well, do not think about murder, do not do not commit adultery, do not lust, that kind of thing. So, go ahead.
My question is, this is gonna sound silly, is general promiscuity covered under this as well?
No.
Okay.
We'll get to some of that in a minute here, actually.
Okay.
So this, it's a really important question that Ian asks. And it's important to notice that in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, it says, "You shall not commit adultery." It does not say you shall not commit any manner of sexual sin. Now, if you go through and you look at Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, there's a whole list of different sexual sins you're not supposed to commit. And many of them are pretty deviant. But the point is that when it comes to the Ten Commandments, the one that he specifically talks about is adultery. And we're going to talk more about why that is, probably not this week, depending on how time gets, but certainly in the next couple of weeks here, because there's some special significance to adultery and to why it's adultery as opposed to simple, playing, what was the term you used?
General promiscuity.
General promiscuity, yes. Admiral, anyway. Okay, so, anyway, yeah. So, when we see, for example, the woman who's brought before Jesus in the act of adultery, the reference is that she was married. It doesn't necessarily address whether the man was married. Now, the Pharisees or whoever was brought in before him, most likely the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, specifically quote this: Moses taught us to put them both to death. Now, they didn't bring the guy along with them. Actually, technically, what they say is that Moses taught us to put somebody who was caught like this to death, and for some reason the guy didn't show up or didn't get brought in there. But in any event, they're correct in that assessment of the law. And in fact, the man should have been put to death as well under that assessment of the law. So when we look in practice, though, what we find is that the law was practiced as either party being married would be a violation. But in enforcement, there is a difference. We see a number of occasions where men who are married do not get put to death for having relations with a woman who is single. Going back before the law even, we see it with Judah and Tamar, we see it with David and Bathsheba, we see it on a number of different occasions. Now in the case of David and Bathsheba should have been put to death because she was married at the time as well. So that isn't necessarily a great example because it's pretty clear God extended a degree of grace in that situation that the situation didn't normally warrant. But there are a number of examples that we can go through and find in the scriptures where men seem to have been allowed to do more even if it was not okay with God. And the punishment seems to have been less. We certainly see men being the ones who are marrying multiple wives where women are not free to marry multiple husbands. And so there does seem to be a difference in how this is applied. And part of that is probably cultural. That would have been the norm in these cultures, that men would have had pretty much complete power and women would have had none. In fact, requiring a certificate of divorce, it was a fairly big step up from what most of the Canaanite cultures would have expected from someone who was divorcing his wife. And so, while I don't have a really good answer to make us all feel good about it, the simple reality is that, what we find in the scriptures is that when the woman is married, then it's death for everybody. When the man is married, it's maybe not. And that's just the way we find it in the scriptures. There's not any good way around that. So, all right, let me move on a little bit here. Okay, now, this isn't just for marriages, and this is something we have, most of you, if you've talked about, if you've looked at the story of Jesus' birth and Mary and Joseph, you know somebody at some point has told you that being engaged in the Jewish tradition is pretty much the same thing as being married for all intents and purposes. And indeed, we find a lot of background for that in places like Deuteronomy chapter 22, where Moses says, if there is a girl who is a virgin engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out of the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death, the girl because she did not cry out of the city, and the man because he has violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. So here, they're not married yet, but they're engaged, and that engagement is enough to qualify her as wife for the purposes of kicking in the adultery statute and the execute both of them statute. And the idea in terms of the location is that she's in a place where had she cried out, others would have heard, and they would have been able to prevent this from happening. Contrast that with the next passage, where he says, if in the field the man finds the girl who's engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so in this case, when they found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. So the distinction appears to be, if you had the opportunity to try to seek, to call out for someone to help, then then the woman would be viewed as being not responsible. But if you did not have that opportunity, if you didn't have that opportunity, you would be viewed as not responsible. If you did have that opportunity, then you would be viewed as also being responsible. But again, it's worth noting here that the man is going to be executed in either situation, because either way, he is sleeping with, having sex with someone who is betrothed or engaged to someone else, and who the scriptures therefore view as being wed to that person already, that there's already an existing marriage there, and that she is the wife of somebody else. Okay, I'm not so much telling you this to point, to spend a lot of time talking about the differences between engagement in our culture and engagement in the Hebrew culture, more just to kind of remind us that in fact engagement itself was a very, very solemn and significant act in the Hebrew culture, even before the official marriage took place. And so it brings it under the same roof as that one. I do find it interesting here that there are some, what as a lawyer I would say, some interesting forensic presumptions that are made about the nature of where the crime takes place. If you can force someone to have sex with you, you can probably force them to not talk if you're strong enough and smart enough. And yet that isn't really, encompassed by this. There's really no thinking in these terms. And it speaks to sort of a primitive way of thinking about things, but it may also speak to the idea that this is actually here again determined or intended to protect the woman beyond what the normal surrounding cultures would do. Because in most of the surrounding cultures, there's this, think about the Islamic cultures, and we've read and seen quite a lot about this in the last decade or so. That in Islamic cultures you have this honor-killing concept, that even when women have been sexually assaulted, that it still becomes the obligation of a family member or the family member of the person who is engaged to that woman or married to that woman to go out and kill the woman, not the person who did it, but the woman, for having allowed it to happen. And there's very little thought given or consideration given to the circumstances, or to whether that person would have, was allowing anything, or simply had the option taken away from them. But because she has become spoiled or defiled, it is now her problem that she's done it. And in the Islamic culture, there would be no fixing that. That woman would be defiled, and she would remain defiled regardless of the circumstances. And so in the Israelite culture, while it seems to us very harsh as a way to look at it, it is still a radical improvement over what most of the people around them are practicing. And I think sometimes we have to remember that when we're looking at the Mosaic Law, is that it sometimes seems very archaic to us, but in reality, it still oftentimes represents an improvement over whatever it was that was going on around them. Now, I got to take a break for just a second here, because I need to make sure, that Sue knows to bring my notes, because otherwise I'm going to have to make a trip home, and that is way worse than making a quick phone call. So I'm going to do something that I never do for my own pulpit, which is actually make a phone call. So, but I'm getting back at all of you who've taken a phone call while I was preaching. So,
Is she awake?
oh, she's awake. She was actually getting ready when I left, so I can. Hi, I don't know if you saw my text, but I left my notes for my sermon on my printer. Could you just grab those and bring them along there? They'll be right there in the tray where it comes out at. Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. Bye-bye. Okay. That's good. All right, so, yes. Or did you had your hand up?
It's interesting how, I look at a lot of this as Old Testament dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, So then when we go to the New Testament, there's a couple of scriptures that sort of, I think, clarify the fact that God wants us both, husbands and wives, to be pure of heart. And so as we look in the Ephesian letter, it says, as the husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for it. So if we love our wives, husbands love wives, and it speaks about wives loving their husbands, just as Christ did, Christ would not commit adultery against his own body, in essence, okay? He would commit sin against it, or break the relationship. And then over in 1 Corinthians, it's, do you not know that the one who joins himself, no, that's not the one I want.
That's irrelevant.
Your bodies are members of Christ, just before that one. Your bodies are members of Christ, and shall I then take away the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? May it never be.
Yeah.
So we have to understand that this goes way beyond just the actions. It goes to a covenant, a commitment.
Right.
And that's what marriage should be.
Yes, and you're getting ahead of me, but I appreciate that because that is where we're going. So there's not any real secrets to this. I think most of you are familiar with the term covenant. And we're going to talk a lot about that as we go further in this, because in the New Testament it's made much more clear. For example, when it talks about there's no distinction, man and woman, I think when you start talking about that, even though we do still see the notion of the concept of male spiritual leadership carried through, when you start saying that there's no distinction in Christ's eyes, it makes it pretty hard to make the argument, well, I'm a guy, so I can do whatever I want to. You know, that's a pretty base argument at that point, and a pretty hard one to sustain. And even in this context, it's important to remember that sexual sin of any sort, even if it didn't lead to execution or to death, was a sin. It wasn't like God was like, yeah, that's okay, just do whatever you want as long as you don't have adultery. You know, and we'll, as I said, we'll go through and see some of those things as we go through here. But so. What may be going on here may be an attempt to compromise between the cultures that the Israelites had been exposed to and had been part of and what God ultimately wanted. It may have been, it may speak to the concepts of male spiritual authority in ways that we don't really grasp. And part of this, I mean, we can't get around the fact that part of this is informed by our Western way of thinking about things. We are used to the idea of relative, if not complete, equity in marriages. Certainly from a legal standpoint today, there is equity in marriages. There's no such, we have no fault divorce in almost every state. We have equal division of property. We have a lot of those kinds of things as being fundamental bases of our marriages. So for us, we have a hard time looking at some of these things and really understanding why they were done this way. And my point is not necessarily to dwell on what distinctions there may be between these two things, but rather to bring out the idea that adultery is the one that God says somebody's got to die for. Most of the rest of the things we're going to look at here in terms of sexual sin, death is not necessarily the outcome. There are a few that there is, and we're not going to get all of those. We're going to primarily focus on the ones that are between men and women, but some of the other ones are. So, let's see, we've gotten through that already. So, Deuteronomy, this is getting us over to the thing that Sylvia had brought up and that we do want to talk about a little bit is Deuteronomy chapter 24, Moses says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. I'm going to stop there for a second. We'll get to the rest of it in a minute. So it's important that he has to give her a certificate of divorce. The Pharisees and teachers of the law had come up with this idea that if you said, I divorce you 3 times to your wife, you were divorced. But that still didn't absolve you from the requirement of actually writing a certificate of divorce. It just meant that the words actually put it into place. Now that was not anything you could find in the Mosaic Law. That was a part of the Talmud, this oral tradition that was supposedly given to Moses. In reality, there's no evidence to suggest that was the case. This was relatively new thought that developed in the third and second century, maybe fourth through second centuries BC, that developed during that period of time and was later on attributed back to Moses because it sure gives a lot more authority when you can say, hey, Moses was told this, rather than, hey, I made this up because I felt like I wanted to be able to divorce my wife easier. So But it's important to note here that the reasoning is simply she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. The term that's used there is basically flaw, is a term that would almost come closer to the one that we would use. And it's likely that Moses' intent and God's intent was to speak to the idea of some kind of a flaw or indecency in the sense of something in the way she behaved or something from a sexual transgression or something like that. But there's nothing, there's not enough specificity there to be confident about that. And so the Pharisees and teachers of the law had taken the position that you could divorce your wife for any reason, basically, as long as you gave her a certificate. That was the one requirement. And the certificate was not insignificant, because without a certificate of divorce, it would be very difficult for that woman to seek to remarry, to do anything, to have any sort of rights or any ability to transact in any way, because divorce took away you would no longer be able to engage in a relationship, because the assumption would be you're still married. And it would be an easy thing in a different culture besides the Israelites to divorce someone and then not create any record of that, so that now you can do whatever you want to, and if somebody questions you, if you have to, you can always write something up. But the woman is stuck not being able to do anything at all because she's outcast and has no longer relationships. So this is a way of quantifying this. But again, we need to note that this is a one direction thing. There's no point in which it says, a woman, a wife, can find no favor with her husband and write him a certificate of divorce and send him off. She's pretty well stuck with the situation. Now, in reality, given the depredations of being a single woman who had been married before and was no longer married in Israelite society, it would be very unlikely that most women would not stick out a fairly rocky situation simply to avoid having to be in that kind of a circumstance. But not impossible, depending on just how bad the situation was. It's also important to recognize that some of the things that today go on in relationships in terms of abuse and everything like that would not have been accepted in Israelite law or Israelite culture most of the time, and would have likely become something that people found out about and knew about. And if nothing else, the brothers of the woman who was being abused would be likely to go over and have a conversation with sticks and rocks with the guy who was doing it. So some of these things that we look at and try and put into our modern context and try to apply become much more problematic when they are in our modern context. If you take it back to the close-knit communities and small families and those kinds of things, it's far, not small families, big families and close-knit communities, it's much less common to have people engaging in some of the behaviors that we deal with because of the likelihood of people finding out and turning it into a problem. So, okay, let's finish this passage out and then we'll stop here. So he puts the certificate of divorce in her hand, sends her out of the house, she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and if the latter husband turns against her, writes her certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house. So first of all, it's important to know, nothing wrong with her going and marrying another man, because she's been divorced, that marriage is over, she can go marry somebody else. It's kind of a bummer that she's now had this happen twice to her, but sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. You shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as inheritance. Why would she have been defiled? Sorry, that was maybe a little bit of a vague question. I don't want to try to answer it. Go ahead, Linda, you try to answer it.
Because she had physical relations with another man.
Okay, so this is where we get into the covenant stuff, and I don't want to do too much about it today because we're already at time, but real briefly, you have a covenant that's formed between her and her husband initially, the first husband. That covenant is broken by her husband, not by her, when he writes her certificate of divorce and sends her away. She is not at fault for that. The one thing about this is, if you give the guy all the power, it's pretty much all his fault at that point. So she's not at fault, so she can go marry somebody else. When she does, they create a covenant of that marriage, and now that covenant has superseded the first covenant, but it is also kind of set in stone that the first covenant is over. There's no going back to that, And so once that husband dies, or she's divorced, or whatever, that covenant ends. Either it ends in divorce, or it ends with the death of the husband, but nevertheless, the one guy she can't go back to is the guy that she was already had a covenant with because of the breach of that first covenant. So it's not simply that she married somebody else. It is the fact that there was a covenant and it was broken, and there was a second covenant that ended, and now that is the one place where you can't be. You can't be having these overlapping covenants like that, or reinstating the existing covenants. We're going to talk a lot more about why that is and how that works in the next couple of weeks here, but that's kind of the key, I think, to understanding. Steve?
I'm glad we don't live in these times.
Yes, me too.
It really makes it look very discouraging to be a woman back in these times. As she runs around with a certificate saying, look, I failed marriage, would you like to marry me?
Twice! I got
And
two
I got
certificates.
flunked out, or I got sent out of the house. And then Jesus even talked with a woman who had 7 husbands. And I'm thinking, man, I'm not going to eat her cooking. Whatever it is. I mean,
I guess, yeah.
killing them off fast. But anyway, her question was different.
Yeah.
But it's like a woman, a widow, something like that just really struggled in the culture.
And that is a good point to make, and probably a good place to end this is a male-dominated culture in a way that we do not have a familiarity with. Now, we have seen some of the behaviors in the Islamic-based cultures and laws of places like Afghanistan and Iran and some of those kinds of things. We have seen how that carries itself out, but even there, those governments have a certain reticence to be completely as over-the-top Islamic as they could be, simply because they cannot, you can't, even they understand there's a limit to what the world will take from you. You know, at some point, somebody's going to step in and go, you know what, we're just not going to let you do this anymore. So they're not, there's a limit certainly to what they will make public anyway, what they will allow to become public. But this is a culture, and around them are cultures that were worse than this by a long shot. But this is a culture in which there is a very clear distinction between the rights that a man has and the rights that a woman has. And by and large, women were not able to take hold of those rights of a man outside of some fairly exceptional circumstances. And in the New Testament, when we encounter women who are doing extraordinary things, a lot of times it's because they're doing them under the auspices of Roman law and not under the auspices of Jewish law. Or they're doing them in places where Jewish law and Roman law intersect, and because of that there's greater freedoms. Because the Romans were definitely, there's no getting around this, the Romans were definitely more progressive when it came to the roles and privileges of the sexes than the Israelites were. And in fairness, that was a law, the Israelite law was developed 2,000 years before the modern Roman law had been developed, and the Romans were ones who were very adaptable to new ideas. As soon as they encountered something they thought worked better, they took it on. Judaism was designed to do exactly the opposite. Just because you think an idea is better, you don't take it on, you only do what God told you to do the first time, and that was 2,000 years ago. So that's the reality of the situation, and the good news is, as Steve says, we don't live in those times anymore. We live under the new covenant. We have a new set of rules, and we live in a society that has a very different perspective. Sometimes, perhaps even to our detriment, not so much in terms of the rights of women, but in terms of how it views marriage and divorce and some of those things. But we'll talk about that in the next couple of weeks here. Thank you guys for your participation.